All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin, for dedicating the shiurim and drashos this month in the schus of Refuah Shlema for their niece, Chava Tzipora Bas Chaya Malka. May she, together with Kol Choli Yisrael, have a complete and enduring refuah. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Shalom and Aviva Kovacs, for dedicating the shir today in memory of Kobe Rosemore, Chaim, Yaakov, David, Zichrono Livracha, Ben Yosef Tzadok, Va'avigail. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah and his family a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. A really interesting daf ahead of us today. I gave you a little bit of a teaser with the Mishnah yesterday, so we'll say let's begin. Today's daf is Peiches 88, and we are picking up Emeretz Hashem at the Mishnah on Pei Zayin Amud Beis 87b. So the Mishnah, All right, the Mishnah reads as follows. So the Mishnah says, Ha'isha shalach baila lemdina sayam. If a woman, her husband, goes overseas, uba'u va'amru la meis ba'alech, and witnesses come back and they tell her, your husband passed away. Vini says, and she gets married. And what happened? Va'achakach ba baila. Then her husband shows up. Apparently he's not dead. Husband shows up. So again, I just want to point out, I'm going to tell you this ahead of time, even though it's going to take the Gemara a little bit of time to figure this out, but we have the advantage of having seen the Gemara. So remember again, case number one is Eid Echad. Even though, again, it's phrased in the plural of Uba'u va'amru la. They came and said to her. What it actually is talking about is a case of a singular witness. An Eid Echad is showing up and telling this woman, your husband passed away. So the Gemara says, so again, she remarries based on the testimony. He shows back up. What's the halacha? Teisei mizeh mizeh. So now what do we have? What do we have on our hands? We have in our hands a situation, we have a problem, right? But we have in our hands a situation of inadvertent adultery. Because at the end of the day, this woman committed adultery. Again, obviously not intentional, right? Not intentional, but lemaisa, de facto, we have a situation of adultery. So therefore, what's the halacha with adultery? The halacha with adultery is she is asur lebal and leboel. She's prohibited to her husband and to the adulterer. In this case, husband number two has the halachic status of an adulterer. Utzricha, therefore, again, she has to get divorced from both of them. Utzricha get mizeh umizeh. And ultimately, again, she has to leave both of these individuals as well. Now, I will say, here's what's interesting. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Teitze mizeh mizeh, very interesting Rashi. Kishar ishes ish shezinsa. No different than any other woman who committed adultery. Dahach lav anusihi. This is not a case where she's anusa, where she's compelled. Ve'afagav dehemenu rabbanan le'eid echad be'isha mishum iguna taimamai mishum dihi gufa daika adad. Because actually we'll get to that in just a little bit. I will say we're going to see that what's interesting about the case of the Eid Echad is like this. We believe in Eid Echad, a singular witness, in a situation where he's coming to testify about a woman's husband that he passed away. Why do we believe in Eid Echad, Rabosai? Why? We're going to see in the Gemara, Mishum Iguna Akilu Barabanan. Chazal had a vest, as much as sometimes the halachic, we'll call it framework, or halachic institution, the institution of halacha gets a bad rap for not caring about the aguna issue. It's not true. Again, there are certain constraints that exist when it comes to the nature of gittin, or the nature of divorce. But lamaisa, again, whenever Chazal could help avoid aguna, they definitely did. So here's a perfect case. When you have a situation of a man traveling overseas, and he doesn't come back home, Chazal said, we will believe the testimony of one witness, of an Eid Echad, to allow the woman to remarry. Both say, huge chiddush. We're going to deal with this in the Gemara. Huge chiddush. But I will say, but here's the reality of it. The reality is, Chazal said to the woman, we're going to believe in Eid Echad. But wife, you have to do your due diligence to ensure that he's actually dead, right? In other words, that the onus is going to be upon you. We will give you the right to rely on an Eid Echad, But the onus is upon you to do the due diligence to make sure that this Eid Echad is telling the truth. And therefore, again, if it turns out that the Eid Echad was not telling the truth, again, that burden is upon you being the wife. And therefore, Allah Lamaisa, Eid Echad shows up, your husband died, we believe him, because again, Rabbi say, in that case, we place the halachic responsibility upon the woman to determine the veracity of this Eid Echad's testimony. If now it turns out that so she remarries, fine, we're all happy, all wonderful. Now husband number one shows up, halacha l'maisa, that burden is upon her. And therefore, she has to go and leave both men. She needs a get from both husbands. Now, both said this is also very interesting as well. Now remember, she needs a get from husband number one because she's still married to him. Technically speaking, why should she need a get from husband number two? Well, so remember again, is marriage number two valid? No, it's midrabanan. Midrabanan, we require her to get a get, to receive a get from husband number two as well. Again, not only that, ve'im ksuva, she has no ksuva from either husband. Velo peros, again, I will say this is the list we've seen already in previous sugyas. No peros, no mizonos, no bilaos, lo alzeh velo alzeh. So I will say, so halacha l'maisa. Now, again, we're going to see the nature of this. It almost feels like this is a certain level of penalty that's imposed upon her. We'll discuss all of this. Ve'natla mizeh u'mizeh tachzir. And I will say, for argument's sake, halacha l'maisa, let's say she collected a ksuva, either from husband number one or husband number two, we make her return it. Make her return it. She's not entitled to the money at all. Vavlad mamzer mizeh u'mizeh. Wow. And offspring that she has with either husband number one or husband number two are both mamzerim. Now let's qualify this a little bit. Take a look at Rashi. Vavlad mamzer mizeh mizeh. Im yolda misheni mamzer gomer. V'im shuv hechzira rishon v'yolda hari mamzer midivreihem. Shabbos said, listen to this. What it means is, any children she had with husband number two are obviously mamzerim. Right? Because we'll say, it turns out that while she was having children with husband number two, she was what? Married woman. Not only that, but if after husband number one comes back, she chooses to go back and live with him and has more children now with husband number one, those are also mamzerim, granted mamzerim midrabanan. So children from husband number two are mamzerim da'araisa, children from husband number one are mamzerim drabanan. No, I think I said it just the opposite. I said it correctly. Children from husband number two are mamzerim da'araisa. Yeah, children from husband number one are mamzerim drabanan. Good. So the Gemara said not only that, v'lo zeh v'zeh mitamela. I both say if these men, the two husbands, are kohanim, neither of them are permitted to become tamei for her. V'lo zeh v'zeh zakan lo b'mitzvah lo ma'aseh adel v'lo ba'afaras nedarah. And neither husband number one nor husband number two are entitled to anything she finds, are entitled to her earnings, and ultimately don't have the right to revoke her vows. Haisa bas Yisrael, if the woman in question ultimately was a bas Yisrael, nifsala min kahuna. So Rabbi say relations with husband number two would then preclude her from whatever marrying a Kohen, because effectively she has the status of a zona. Ubas Levi, if she's a bas Levi, relations with the second man, which is effectively adultery, precludes her from eating Meiser Rishon, Ubas Kohen Minat Truma. And ultimately, again, if she's a Bas Kohen, relations with husband number two go ahead and preclude her from eating Truma. Ve'in Yarshin Shalzeh, the Yarshin Shalzeh, Yarshin es Ksuvasa. And I both say neither set of heirs, children from husband number one or children from husband number two, have the ability to inherit her ksuva. And I both say this seems to be a contradiction because we just said before that what? She has no ksuva. Okay, so we'll discuss this in the Gemara. V'mesu echa v'mesu. And I will say, if either of these men died, husband number one or husband number two, without children, so what's the halacha? Echav shalzeh ve'echav shalzeh cholzin v'lo miyabmin. Both brothers, right? Brother of husband number one or brother of husband number two, do chalitza, but no yibum. The Rebbe say this is fascinating. So Rashi points out that cholzin achiv shal rishon, or I should say echav shal rishon midaraisa cholitz. V'rabbanan gazer d'lo liyabin. Ve'echav shal sheni cholitz midrabbanan. Rebbe say we're going to see again. Brother of husband number one does chalitza midaraisa. brother of husband number 2, does chalitza midrabanan. Midrabanan. Okay, good. So we'll say this is the Tana Kama of the Mishnah. Right? First opinion in the Mishnah, Rabbi, so you see, it's fascinating. It's two sides of the same coin. On one hand, what we have over here is an overwhelming kula, that we're going to allow a woman to remarry based on the testimony of an Eid Echad, of one witness, which is an incredible kula. The flip side to that is that, therefore, again, as we said before, the burden of it's not the burden of proof. Well, it is the burden of determining the legitimacy of this Eid Echad is upon the woman. And therefore, if it turns out that the Eid Echad was incorrect, ultimately, again, it is the woman who is left holding the bag on all of the fallout from this. Okay, now a couple of dissenting opinions. Rabbi Yossi says, Ksuvasa, al nichse baila rishon. Rabbi Yossi says she does have a ksuva, and her ksuva ultimately is on the property of husband number 1. Okay, Rabbi Elazar Omer, harishon zakai b'mitziasa, o b'maaseh yadeha, u b'hafaras nedareha. Rabbi Elazar says that the first husband is in fact entitled to anything she finds, to her earnings, and the ability to go ahead and revoke her vows. Rabbi Shimon says, Bi'asa chalitzasa me'echav sharishon poteres tzarasa ve'in havlad mamzer. Rabbi Shimon says either relations, right, yibum, or chalitza with the brother of the first husband has the ability to exempt any co-wives, and ultimately if she goes back and lives with husband number 1 after his return, the offspring are not mamzerim. So Rabbi say the common denominator amongst these three opinions, again we'll discuss them all in greater depth in the Gemara, is they're saying that we still ascribe some level of legitimacy to marriage number 1. Rabbi Yossi saying her ksuva comes from husband number 1. Rabbi Elazar saying husband number 1 still has his marital rights. Why should he lose his marital rights? And Rabbi Shimon saying if she does end up living again with husband number 1, ultimately none of the children are mamzerim. Incredible. V'niseis shelo b'reshos. And I will say all of this is okay. Interesting formulation here. V'niseis shelo b'reshos. And I will say here's what's fascinating. If she gets remarried without the reshus of Beis Din, so I will say this sounds like she's doing something wrong, right? But in fact, look at Rashi. This is so interesting. Nisei shelo b'reshos Beis Din. Rashi says, "Sheba'u shnei eidim va'amru meis ba'alech v'niseis miatzma shari lo haisa tzricha leheter Beis Din." See, I will say when we're dealing with an Eid Echad, a singular witness, a lone witness, so the truth is that only works if done through the mechanism of Beis Din, right? In other words, Eid Echad shows up, a person by themselves has no ability to take action based on an Eid Echad. But if halacha l'maisa, again, Eid Echad shows up to Beis Din then has the ability to activate an Eid Echad. This case of v'nisei shelo b'reshus is a case of two witnesses. See, I will say, when two witnesses show up, you don't really need Beis Din. I mean, technically, you don't need Beis Din because two witnesses utter a testimony, and I am permitted to take action based on the words of two witnesses. So look at Rashi again. Nisei shelo b'reshus Beis Din, sheba'u shnei eidim va'amru meis ba'alech. This is where two witnesses came along and said, your husband died. The niseis mi'atzma shahari lo haisa tzricha leheter Beis Din. When there are two witnesses, a woman doesn't need a heter from Beis Din to remarry, because at the end of the day, she has two witnesses. So when he says, "B'shelo b'reshus mutar lachzor lo," supposed to listen to this. So this is actually an interesting case. If she supposed to say two witnesses now show up, and two witnesses say your husband died. Your husband died, right? Supposed to say she's allowed to get remarried. Halach. So what happens now? Husband number 1, so she gets married to husband number 2. Husband number 1 shows back up. What's the halacha? This is fascinating. Muteres lachzor lo. She is permitted to go back to husband number 1. Right? Now both say, now why? Why is that? Rashi says over here, da'anusahi. Rabbi say this is a case of anus. This is a case of just extenuating circumstances that this woman could have done nothing to prevent. In other words, Rabbi say, if there is one ironclad rule in halacha, it is two witnesses are two witnesses. I was supposed to say everything in our legal system operates around two witnesses. So Lemaisa, again, the fact that she took action based on two witnesses means she is 100% in the right. She's in the right. So now it turns out that the witnesses were wrong. Okay, what is a person supposed to do? She did everything that halacha demanded of her. As a result, she's in anusa. So I'll say, you see the difference over here? You see, one witness gives her the license to remarry, but that license comes with a heavy burden of responsibility upon her to make sure the one witness was right. If she does not do her due diligence, as evident by the fact that the husband's showing back up, Lemaisa then, she's stuck with ramifications. But in the case there are two witnesses, it's interesting. There's no due diligence upon her. Now, there's a due diligence of cross-examination. That's why we're going to see Shalo Birshos Beis Din doesn't mean that simply two guys show up at her door and say, hey, by the way, your husband's dead. Sorry, when's the chasana? That's not the pshat. That's not the pshat. But what it means is, so we're going to see there's always some level of fact-checking when it comes to witnesses. But Lamais, again, with two witnesses, halacha is on her side. You are absolutely unequivocally permitted to get remarried. When it turns out that the two witnesses were wrong, for whatever the reason, Lamais, the law is on her side, and the law protects her. So she's permitted to go back to husband number one. Incredible. Of course. That's why it says all of it happens in Beis Din. Yeah, we're going to see, absolutely. She's informed about her responsibilities at all times. So the Gemara says, Al pi Beis, I'm sorry, Vim nisei shlo b'shos mutaris lachshalo, nisei al pi Beis Din. Now we'll say we're jumping back. Now if she gets married based on the testimony of one witness, Teitzei, so again, as we said before, she has to leave both husbands, upetura mina karban. The Rebbe say now we're jumping a little bit and we're talking about now carbonic liability. If you look at Rashi, petura mina karban, the yachid sha'asab horaz beis din pater. See, Rebbe say effectively now she has to bring a carbon chatos, right? Because she went ahead and she committed adultery. So here's what's interesting: she is not going to be obligated in a carbon. Why? Because at the end of the day, when a person commits an avera through the instruction of Beis Din, they're parted from a carbon. Now I'll say, now what does that mean? Even in the case of Eid Echad, it turns out that the woman, maybe either she didn't do her due diligence or she did do her due diligence, but just some crazy situation. But Lamaisa, what she did was legal. Why was it legal? Because it was done through the instruction of Beis Din. Because of that, as much as there we'll call marital liability, halacha Lamaisa, there's no carbonic liability. She doesn't have to bring carbon. So the Gemara says, carbon. Lo nisei sapi Beis Din, but if she did not get married based on Beis Din, in other words, Rabbi say, which means two witnesses, then halacha lamaisa teitzei v'chayeves bekarban. Ultimately, again, she's going to be obligated to leave the husband, and halacha lamaisa bring a carbon. Again, we'll see why this is. Rashi says over here, ela be'edim chayeves bekarban d'shogegesi. Ein ze ones. Okay, we'll see the distinction between the cases. So Yafek Koach Beis Din. So Beis Din has a power. Shepotra min hakarban. This is an interesting fact over here. When she gets married, because of the testimony of one witness, all of this is happening through the purview of Beis Din. The nice thing is when you operate through the purview of Beis Din, you have what? You're covered. Not sure, what's the word? You have. It's a word for, I guess, immunity, carbonic immunity, right? You're happy, you're right, because you're operating through Beis Din, you have carbonic immunity. As opposed to when you get married based on two witnesses, you may or may not be using the framework of Beis Din. If you're not using the framework of Beis Din, you don't have carbonic immunity. So it's interesting. So as much as two witnesses give you what we'll call marital immunity, they don't give you carbonic immunity. One witness doesn't give you marital immunity, but does give you carbonic immunity. Again, we'll see all the details of this. So we'll say, last case, haro Beis Din linase, v'halcha v'kilkala. We'll say, let's say Beis Din paskin that she has the right to remarry. Say based on one witness, she has the right to remarry, or even based on two witnesses, v'halcha v'kilkala. And she went and she just behaved immorally. In other words, that she had relations with men, not for the sake of going ahead and getting married. Chayeves bekarban. So Rabbi say, in this case over here, Eid Echad, as much as we said with Eid Echad, because it's happening through Beis and she has Karbana community, the Karbana community only applies to what? To marriage. But if Halacha L'maisa, she just went ahead and had relations with men, not in the context of marriage, ultimately, again, she is liable. Shelo hitiruha ela linase. Because Halacha L'maisa, again, her license was only for marriage, not for immoral behavior. Incredible, Rabbi say. Let's go. Says the Gemara, a lot to do. Midiktani seifa nises shelo bershus muteres lachsarlo shelo bershus bezdin ela be'edim. So Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. The seifa, the second part of the Mishnah, said that if she gets married shelo bershus, right? So if she gets married shelo bershus without the permission of bezdin, and then husband number one shows back up, she's permitted to go ahead and go back and resume living with him. Now, we could infer from this that what does Shelo B'Rishos Bezdin mean? Shelo B'Rishos means without the Rishos of Bezdin, but with two Eidim. We already said it in the Gemara, right? That's what it means. Therefore, I will say by definition, Mechlal Dereisha, B'Rishos Bezdin U'Be'ed Echad. So therefore, I will say we have to say that at the beginning of the Mishnah, where it says B'Rishos Bezdin means what? With the permission of Bezdin, one witness. One witness, I will say, which is how, again, this is how we read the Mishnah, thanks to Rashi, from the beginning. That the first case in the Mishnah, what we call Birshus Bezdin, is a case of Eid Echad. One witness is coming along and saying, Rachel, we know your husband Ruvain died. Bezdin hears this. Bezdin says, okay, Rachel, you have the right to believe this Eid Echad. Parentheses, but the obligation of due diligence and making sure that, right, explaining the veracity of this claim is upon you. What do we see from Rabbi say? Alma, Eidecha Ne'eman. Wow. Rabbi, you know what the most startling thing of this Mishnah is? That we believe in Eid Echad. Wow, who knew? Up until now, my whole life, I've been conditioned to think that we believe two Eidim, which is the second part of the Mishnah. Now you're telling me we believe in Eid Echad, one witness. Rabbi say, by the way, in such a dramatic fashion. Remember again, this is an Eid Echad, ultimately again by what? By marriage. To which the Gemara says, here we go, Utna nami huchsekul yos masiyin mipi eid, v'isha mipi isha, v'isha mipi eved, umipi shifcha. Alma Eid Echad Ne'eman. Now that we're going to see that ultimately they would allow women to remarry based on the testimony of one witness from another witness, or one woman from another woman, or a woman from an Eved, or from a Shifcha. Shabbos, you see in all these cases that in Eid Echad, one witness is believed. Utnana, we also learned, Eid Echad, Omer Achalta Chelev, V'hu Omer Lo Achalti. But it's an interesting case. If an Eid Echad says, Eid Echad comes over to me, he says, Silber, you ate Chelev, you ate forbidden fat, right? And I say, no, I didn't. What's the halacha? I'm pater. Taimud Omer Lo Achalti. The reason I'm pater Rabbi is why? Because I said I didn't. So the Eid Echad's word is no stronger than my word. But what do you see from here? Ha'ishtik mehemen. Had I not said anything, right? The Eid Echad shows up and he says, hey, Silber, you ate chelev. And I didn't say anything. The Eid Echad were believed. Alma, Eid Echad mehemen. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see the Eid Echad is believed. So we'll say, so bottom line, right? All of this was just backing up the Gemara's assertion. But the most novel ruling in our Mishnah is that in Eid Echad, a single witness is believed. To which the Gemara asks, Midaraisa min alan. Rabbi say, Midaraisa, how do we know that we are allowed to believe in Eid Echad? How do we know that? The Sanya, O hoda elav chataso. Rabbi say, the pasuk by chatos says, you will know about your liability. You will come to know that you made a mistake. Veloshi adu acherim. They will say, so there is only chatas liability if you come to know on your own about your liability, but not if someone else makes you aware of it. You might have thought that if someone comes to tell you, an Eid Echad comes to tell you that you did something wrong, and you don't contradict the Eid Echad that you'll be pater, Tamalomar, oh hoda elav, mikol makom, or it becomes known to you. So we'll say, what's going on over here? Hechidan, what's the case? So we'll say, if we're talking about a case where, let's say again, two witnesses show up, and they say, let's go back to the chelev case. They say, Silber, you ate chelev, and I don't contradict them. They will say, I don't need a pasuk to teach me liability. That's obvious, right? I'm not contradicting. Two witnesses come along and say, I did something wrong. Of course, I'm going to be liable. Elalav chad. Rather, Rabbi Yossi is talking about one witness. And I will say the Torah is teaching me that if one witness shows up and tells me that I did something wrong, and I don't contradict the witness is believed. What does that show you? That Eid Echad is Mehemen. Shmamina Eid Echad Ne'eman. Umimai de Mishum de Mehemen. Dilma Mishum de Kashasek Ushtika Koda Damya. They will say maybe it's not because one witness is believed, but maybe when one witness shows up and tells you, well, watch this case. Witness shows up and says, Silber, you ate chaylev. And I don't say anything. I don't contradict him. Maybe the reason I'm liable is not because one witness is believed, but rather why? Shtiga koda, silence, right? If I'm silent and I'm admitting. To which the Gemara says, Teida diktani seifa, amru shnayim achal techelev, v'hu omer lo achalti pater. So I'll say, look at the last case of the Braisa. Two witnesses show up and they say, Silber, you ate chaylev. And I say, no, I didn't. Pater, I am pater from liability. Meir says, you're chayiv. Rabbi Meir says, Kavachomer, im hevio shnayim l'dei misa chamura. We'll say if two witnesses can make me liable to a death penalty, chas v'shalom, lo yevio l'dei karban akal, then certainly again two witnesses can make me chayiv for a karban, even if I say I'm not chayiv. Amru lo, ma im yirtze lomar mezid hayisi. You know what I'll say? Here's what's interesting. When two witnesses show up and halacha l'maisa say that I ate chaylev and chayiv a karban, and I say no, I didn't. You know why I'm believed? I'll say no, I'm believed because I could always have another claim as amigo. I could have said what? I intentionally ate chaylev. We'll say, what's the liability if you intentionally ate chaylev? Well, again, it's kares, but lamaisa, there's no carbonic liability. In other words, I could have made a claim to exempt myself from carbonic liability. Because that's the case, I'm also believed to say I didn't eat chaylev, even when two witnesses show up. So the Gemara says, Reisha, top of Pechas, Reisha, my time mekayim chayvim rabbanon. So we'll say, ultimately, again, why is it that Rabbanan caused me to be liable in the first case where I was quiet? If you want to say it's because it's an Eid Echad, ultimately when I don't contradict an Eid Echad, ultimately I'm liable. Yet Abba said generally in the case of two witnesses, where Allah Chalamayim they're believed, even when I do contradict them, in this case Rabbanan Pater, rather Abba must say because I was silent, and therefore Ushtika Keoda Damya. So Abba say, so bottom line what the Gemara is saying over here is, there's no raya from this case that Eid Echad is believed. There's no raya that Eid Echad is believed. Because Rabbi say, it's just as possible that the reason ultimately, again, that there's liability in this case is why? Shtika koda. Because silence is like admittance, right? Silence is like admitting. So if Rabbi say, we're still back to square one, which is, how do I know that midda oraisa, there is a concept ultimately of shtika koda? How do I know that? So says the Gemara, says Ella, listen to this. Svarahi. Rather, says the Gemara, in fact, it's a svara. It's a svara that Eid Echad is believed. I will say, what's the svara? Listen to this. Midi dehavi achaticha safek shachelev. Midi dehavi achaticha safek shachelev safek shal shuman. Now, listen to this case. Very interesting. You have a piece of meat. Safek chelev, safek shuman. Now, I will say, chelev is aser. Shuman is mutter. Okay, now what happened? I will say, I ate a piece of meat. So what happened? Va'asa Eid Echad va'amar barli de shuman hu. So I will say, Eid Echad comes along and says, I'm telling you, I know for sure that it was shuman. It was fat. It wasn't chaylev. What's the halacha? Dimhemen. Eid Echad is believed. So I will say, what do you see from here? That Eid Echad is believed in certain circumstances. So the Gemara says, no. Midami hasam lo ishtek. Hasam lo ischazik isura. To which the Gemara says, that's not a fair case, Rabbosai. Because remember again, what is this case, Rabbosai? This is a case of safek. Lo ischazik isura means that we have never established that there is something usher over here. In other words, remember again, what's the case? The case over here is a case of safek. There's a piece of meat. We're not sure. Is it chelev? Is it shuman? So we don't even have any definitive isser over here. So in that case, Eid Echad shows up. I ate it, right? So Eid Echad shows up afterwards and says, oh, by the way, that was shuman. It wasn't chelev. He's believed. To which the Gemara says, you can't bring a raya that we believe in Eid Echad from that case. Because Rabbi says it's just as possible. That's a different kind of case. In that case, we never established that there was Isser. However, again, Halcha is Chazik Yisur de Ishes Ish. Rabbi saying in the case of our Mishnah, we have an established Isser. What's the established Isser? Married woman. And maybe ve'ein davar shebe'ever pachos mishnayim. And I will say again, maybe when we have an established Isser, in general, I will say our principle is, right, our guiding light rule is, davar sher be'erva, anytime you're dealing with an established Isser of erva, you always need two witnesses. So from where do we know that we rely on one witness? So I'll say better case. A case of meat that we know is chelev. Va'asa eid echad va'amar bari li d'shuman hava d'lo mehemen. So I'll give you a better case. Let's say you have a piece of meat that we know to be chelev, and an eid echad shows up and says, "I know for sure it's not chelev, it's shuman." So we'll say, "What's the halacha? D'lo mehemen." We don't believe him in that case. So we'll say that would be a good raya. That's what? That'd be a good raya. That halacha l'maisa, he's not believed. Right? He's not believed. So Eid Echad is not believed. Midami, that's not fair. Midami, hasma fido asu be mea lo mehemni. So we'll say that's not fair. Because we'll say, when you have a situation of something that has an established status, even if 100 people show up, they can't change the status. Hacha kevan dechi asu be tre mehemni, chad nami lehemna. So we'll say, in this case over here, however, even though we know the woman was asur, if two witnesses show up and say, we know your husband died, they are believed. So too, one witness will be believed as well. So the Gemara says, Midi dehavi atevel hekdish v'konamos. Because we'll say this should be like the case of tevel, hekdish, and konamos. Remember again, tevel is untithed produce, hekdish, consecration, konamos, we'll say, is a konam vow. Konam vow is where you prohibit something to yourself. So watch this. Hi tevel hechi dami. What's the case? We'll say all fascinating cases. So the Gemara says, if it's a case of tevel, Rabbi say, if we're talking about a case where you have tevel, untithed produce, and an Eid Echad shows up and says, it's not tevel, it was tithed, of course he's going to be believed. You know why? Mishum dibiyado l'takno. Because Rabbi say, remember again, you're always believed to testify about something that you have the ability to remedy. So if an Eid Echad shows up and testifies about his own produce and says, I testify that this is tithed produce, of course he's going to be believed. Why? Because Lamaisa, he has the ability and he has the power to fix it. Rather, he must be that an Eid Echad is showing up and testifying about the produce of another, that Ruvain's produce is tithed. So the Gemara says, "My kasavar." We'll say first wide line. So what do we hold? I kasavar Torah mishalosh chavero eno tzarach das bailim mishum diabel takna. So what is interesting machlokes? Does one have the right to tithe someone else's produce? So I will say, if you hold that one person has the right to tithe someone else's produce without their permission, then of course when Eid Echad shows up, I show up and I say Ruvain's produce is tithed, I'm going to be believed. Why? Because I have the ability to control that process. V'ikasavar tzarech das bailim, and if you hold that Allah Chalamaisa, you need the consent of the owner. Va'amar ana yedana beidim etakinhu gufa minalan. So I will say, and if you hold that we're talking about a case where I don't have the right to go ahead and tithe someone else's produce, and now I'm showing up and testifying about Ruvain's produce that is tithed, how do I know that I'm believed in that case? Hekdish nami. I will say, what's the case of hekdish? If we're talking about a situation of an item that has monetary sanctity, mishum dibiyadu liftoso. So we'll say, if it's my property, I'm believed about it. Why? Because I have the ability to redeem it. Ikidushas haguf, and if we're talking about again halacha l'maisa, something that has physical sanctity, which doesn't have the ability to be redeemed. If we're talking about my own property, I'm believed mishum dibiyadu lishtoli alei, because I have the right to go ahead and try to revoke the vow that made it kadosh. We're talking about the hektish of someone else. And I'm coming along and I'm saying, I know that Ruvain went ahead and did ataras nedarim on the vow that made his item kadosh. He gufa. So the Gemara says, he gufa minalan. How do I know that that's true? I don't know that Eid Echad has the power to do so. Konamos. They will say, what's the case of konamos? If we're talking about So I will say, if you say that when something is subject to a konam vow, it is subject to, I will say, konam vow means, again, I make a vow, making something prohibited to my use, but for the mikdash, if you hold that there is me'ilah, and ultimately financial sanctity, then I'm believed to testify about it. Why? Because I have the ability to redeem it. V'ikasavra in me'ilah b'konamos, v'ser ba'amahu, and if you say again, there's no me'ilah by konamos, and I don't have the ability to redeem it, but rather again, it's just a state of iser that devolves upon an item subject to a konam vow. Idide, if it's my own property, mishum debiyodol, then I have the ability to go ahead and we'll say have the vow that made it a konam, or have the konam vow revoked. But if it belongs to someone else, who says that an Eid Echad is believed? So if Rabbosai, what comes out over here is we have been unsuccessful in determining a biblical source for the fact that an Eid Echad should be believed. We cannot come up with a case, the biblical precedent that shows the Eid Echad is Rabbosai. So therefore, the entire Mishnah is based on the premise that we believe a single witness. Where does that come from? Here we go, Rabbosai. Two important lines, most important lines in this sugya. Amar Zera, mitoch chomer shechmarta aleya besofa, hikalta aleya betchila. So the Gemara says, because we are machmir with her in the end, which means, because if this single witness is wrong, right, we bring the law down on her, right? The entire legal system comes crashing down on her. Rabbosai, right? We're going to be machmir on her that if the Eid Echad is wrong, all of these things, teitzei mizeh umizeh, she has to leave both men, mamzer, no ksuva, no peiros, no mizonos, no belos. Therefore, because we're going to be machmir on her in the end, we're makil on her in the beginning, ultimately to allow her to remarry based on one witness. To which the Gemara says, what does that mean? Lo lachmir v'lo lekol. So better yet, don't be makil, you want to be machmir. To which the Gemara is supposed to say, here it is, mishum iguna akilu bahu Rabbanon. Rabbi say this is the phrase which drives this entire sugya. See, Rabbi say we have a problem. What's our problem? Aguna. And Rabbi say our problem is actually potential aguna. We now have a situation of a missing husband. No one knows what has happened to him. So Rabbi say we have two choices. Choice number one is wait. Just wait. How long? However long it takes. But we could be running into a serious aguna problem where a woman is going to be literally again stuck in this marriage. So Chazal make a decision. And the decision they make, Rabbi say, is we're going to allow the woman to remarry based on the fact that someone says her husband is dead. Right? So Rabbi say, so essentially in halacha, how are we looking at this woman? How are we looking at her? She's an almana. She's a widow. But she's a tenuous widow. Right? It's a widow based just on the testimony of one witness. Now, we're going to go with it. Chazal said we're going to go with it because the alternative is leaving her in aguna. But what the halacha does, as we said before, is place the full responsibility on this Eid Echad on the woman. So we'll say we're going to give her the pathway to remarriage. We're going to give her the license. Now, both say, so what we're saying is there biblical precedence for Eid Echad being believed? Both say, does it exist in halacha? Now the truth is, we're going to see it does. For example, there's the concept of Eid Echad Naaman Be'isurin. For example, Rabbi say Hilchos Nida, right? Who's believed about a woman's status when it comes to Hilchos Nida? Who's believed? The woman is believed. Right? Rabbi say we don't need two witnesses to show up and say, okay, Rachel could go to the mikveh tonight, right? So Rabbi say, so we see that halacha lemaisa, we do have biblical precedent for Eid Echad Naaman Be'isurin. But Rabbi say, but lemaisa again in Inyane Ishos we don't. But this is a special dispensation that Chazal made to avoid aguna. But the counterbalance to it is the entire responsibility for this kula rests with the woman. She has to do her due diligence. So I will say that, and that's the surah of this entire sugya. Incredible. So I will say, so remember again, if husband number one does show back up, and it turns out that the Eid Echad was wrong. And by the way, when you say the Eid Echad is wrong, it doesn't have to be ultimately, again, that the Eid Echad did anything intentionally wrong. He just had wrong information. So Lamaisa, again, Teitzi Mizem is that she has to leave both husbands. So Amarav, Lo shanu ela shenises be'ed echad. So we'll say that's only true if she remarried based on one witness. Aval nises api shnei edim lo teitzei. Wow. So we'll say Rav says, but if she got married based on the testimony of two witnesses, she does not have to go ahead and leave. Rav will say, she doesn't have to leave who? The second husband. Wow. So the Gemara says, Rav says this, Machku aleh b'ma'arava. When they heard this ruling in Eretz Yisrael, they laughed at Rav. Ridiculous. You don't have to leave the second husband. What are you talking about? The first husband is there. He's holding the wedding album. Right? What do you, and right, I'm alive and well. Shalom Aleichem. Right? What do you mean she doesn't have to leave the second husband? Asa Gavra, Vikoi. The first husband is standing there and he says, Shalom Aleichem Rachel, so nice to see you. I missed you. I see clearly it wasn't mutual. Right? But Lamaisa again, husband number one is standing there. So what do you mean she doesn't have to leave husband number two? Va'at amrat lo teitzei, lo tzricha de lo yadin le. Ultimately, what's the case? That is fascinating. Husband number one shows up. He says, Rachel, it's me, Ruvain. And she says, who? Right? Who? In other words, we'll say, it's not just, in other words, nobody recognizes this guy. Now, 1 second. Now, we'll say, now, that's true. By the way, if a guy shows up claiming that he's Rachel's first husband, Ruvain, and no one recognizes him, then the truth is, I will say, even in the case of Eid Echad, we would allow her to stay married to husband number two. So we'll say the listen to this. This is fascinating. What's the case? The case is where, watch this. Ruvain shows back up, husband number one. No one recognizes Ruvain. No one recognizes him. But he brings two witnesses. And two witnesses say, this is Ruvain. We've been with him from the time he left town to the time he now came back to this moment. It's him. Just none of you recognize him. And that could happen. Dichsiv, Vayaker Yosef es Echav, Vehem lo hikiruhu. The pasuk says, right before Yosef revealed his identity, he's viceroy in Egypt. Yosef recognized his brothers. They did not recognize him. Va'amar Rav Chisda, melamed sheyatza b'lo chasima zakan, uba b'chasima zakan. What happened? Yosef didn't have a beard when he left his house, and now he had a beard. And both say it was more than a beard. Yosef suffered so much in life. The brothers suffered so much in life. And suffering, again, ultimately causes a person to look different in every single way. The point of Rabbi Shmuel is that it's possible sometimes that even someone who is your brother, someone who you're in the same family with, over time you just simply do not recognize them. I will say it's ultimately such an incredible yesod, sometimes again, in the power of chait as well. That sometimes we do things in life, and we don't recognize who we were, or who we once were. Vayaker Yosef es echa v'hem lo ikiru. See, Rebbe say, they thought Yosef was a sinner. They thought Yosef was a rasha. And therefore, ultimately, again, he had become unrecognizable. They didn't see any good in him. Yosef understood that despite his brother's mistreatment of him, he still saw the good in them. He recognized them. That was the godless of Yosef. Despite the fact that they mistreated him so badly, he still recognized the good inside of them. The problem with the brothers, they never saw the good inside of Yosef. They never saw anything good. I will say such an incredible yesod about how we interact with ourselves and others. Sometimes we look at ourselves and all I see is the bad. I don't see any good. Sometimes I look at the other and all I see is the bad. I don't see any good. The goal in life is to be a Yosef. Because this is the distinction. Yosef, brothers saw they saw nothing good in Yosef. Yosef, despite the fact that he was mistreated by his brothers, Vayaker Yosef es Echav, he saw the good in them. Goal in life is to be a Yosef. So Sof training who. So we'll say, so now watch this. So we'll say, so just to see how we're setting up this case. So Rav said that halacha l'maisa, if a woman went ahead and remarried based on the testimony, ultimately again of two witnesses, she doesn't, and husband number one shows up, she doesn't have to leave husband number two. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? So what's the case? What's the case, Rabbi? The case over here is where witnesses showed up. Two witnesses showed up. So if two witnesses showed up, don't you have to go ahead and leave husband number two? No one recognizes him. So the Gemara says, no. What's the case? What's the case? The case is where two witnesses show up, and halacha lamaisa say, two witnesses show up with Ruvain, and they say, we've been with Ruvain this entire time since he left. Sof, Trey. Utrei ninu. I will say, is this not a case? Ultimately, again, sof trei utrei ninu. Amabeis v'haba'aleh ba'asham talui kai. So I will say, still, how are we able to go ahead and allow this woman to remain married to husband number two? So we'll say, what do we have now? We have two witnesses who say that what? Reuven's dead. We also have two witnesses that say that what? Reuven's alive. And we also have a guy who's standing here who says that what? Hi, I'm Reuven. Right, I'm Reuven. So we'll say we have two witnesses against two witnesses. Rav is suggesting that allows the woman to remain married to husband number two. But how? We'll say at the end of the day, this is a paradigmatic case of Asham Talui. We'll say, what's Asham Talui? A case where you may be doing something prohibited. So how would we allow Rachel to remain married to husband number two, to Shimon, when we know that there is this case, this possibility that her first husband is still alive? Every single time she would have relations with her second husband, Shimon, there'd be an obligation of Asham Talui. Amar Rav Sheshes Kigon Sheni says le'echad me'edeha. Wow. Let's say, get ready for this. What's the case? I'll say, get ready. The case is where, so I'll say, just to follow the progression, right? Reuven goes overseas, doesn't come back. Two witnesses show up, and they say, Reuven died. Wonderful. You know what I'll say? So Rachel, in the course of the conversation, Rachel strikes up a conversation with one of the witnesses, right? And what happens? She marries one of the witnesses. It's a great Sheva Brachas. How did you guys meet? Oh, right, he was one of the witnesses, amazing, right? So she marries one of the witnesses. Then I will say, now then what happens? Two witnesses show up, Reuven, a guy claiming to be Reuven shows up, right? With no one recognizes him. Reuven brings two witnesses that he's really Reuven. So I will say, now Rav says she can stay married to Shimon. But it's 2 against 2, Asham Talui. No, the guy who she's married to is one of the witnesses. And Rabbi say, now, why does that matter? Watch this, Rabbi say. Because it's only an Asham Talui if for you it's a case of that apostle prohibition. If she married one of the original witnesses, one of the two who said their husband's dead, they have no doubt. Reuven's dead. They testify to it. They know with certainty that Reuven's dead. Because they know with certainty that Reuven's dead, therefore, again, this man, if he has relations with Rachel, there's no Asham Talui, because for him, there's no doubt. There's no doubt that Reuven's dead. He testified in unequivocal fashion, Reuven is dead. So the Gemara says, but still, he gufa ba'asham talui kaima. That's fine, that the husband, Shimon, doesn't have an asham talui. What about Rachel herself? Ba'omeres barili. She says, I know for sure this guy is not my husband Reuven. I know my husband Reuven. We were married for years. This is not just a pshat that he grew a beard, right? He colored his hair, he got a haircut, whatever it is. Lamais, again, it's not him. So I will say, if that's the case, that ultimately, again, she's married to one of the witnesses, so husband therefore has no case of possible doubt. He knows for sure it's not Reuven. She says for sure it's not Reuven, so what's the problem? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi lo ka'amar ela kishabo edim v'achar kach nises. Even Rabbi Menachem, who says that she has to leave husband number 2, only said that's the case when? That's the case where the second set of witnesses came before she remarried. Aval nises v'achar kach bo edim lo amar, but ba'alacha l'maaseh, if she remarried first, and then you have this little bit of a crazy case. Even Rabbi Nachum would agree that she could remain married. This Sanya. So we'll say, here we go. Shnaim omrim meis, or shnaim omrim lo meis. So we'll say, watch this. If you have a case, Reuven went overseas. Rachel's in Beis Din. Right? 2 witnesses say Reuven died. Another set of witnesses come along and say Reuven didn't die. Or Shnayim Omrim Niskarsha, Ushnayim Lo Niskarsha. Similar case, Rabbi say, two witnesses say Ruvain divorced Rachel. Two witnesses say Ruvain never divorced Rachel. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Harei lo tinase. So we'll say, so this is just a stammer case, which makes sense. She can't remarry. We'll say, why can't she remarry? Why can't she remarry? She essentially, you have two witnesses against two witnesses. We'll say, what's the effect of two witnesses against two witnesses? They kind of cancel each other out. We're just going to a holding pattern. V'im nises lo seitze. But if she did get remarried, I will say, halach l'maisa, we won't make her leave her second husband. Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi Omer Teitzer. Menachem Rabbi Yossi says, no. I will say, if you have 2 verse 2 and she still gets married, she has to leave that second husband. However, Amar Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi Emas Ani Omer Teitzer. When do I say that she has to leave husband number 2? Bisman shebo edim va'achar kach nises. I will say that's when you have 2 verses 2 and then she gets remarried. Aval nises. But I will say, watch this. If 2 witnesses show up and we say, we know Ruvain died, and then Rachel gets remarried, and then 2 more witnesses come along and say, no, Ruvain's alive and well. She doesn't have to leave husband number 2. So I will say, so therefore, even Rabbi Nachman would agree. I will say, so here's what we have, just to illustrate what we have over here. We have a case now of halacha l'maisa. Ruvain goes overseas. 2 witnesses come along and say, Ruvain died. Rachel gets remarried. Now, interestingly, wrinkle on this, who does she marry? One of the witnesses. Now, 2 more witnesses. Now, Reuven shows back up. It's me. Rachel says, I have no idea who you are. No one recognizes Reuven. Reuven produces 2 witnesses that he's Reuven. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha? What does Rav say? She could remain married to husband number 2. She can remain number 2. Why? I will say, what's the logic of it? The logic of it was that, remember, there's no Asham Talui, because she says, I know this isn't Ruvain. Her husband, Shimon, who also happens to be one of the witnesses, who was one of the original witnesses, says, I know it's not Ruvain. Or I should say, I know that Ruvain's dead. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, she's permitted to remain remarried. And even Rabbi Menachem, who would say that in a case of 2 verses 2, she cannot remarry, says she cannot remarry after the second set of witnesses came. But if she remarries before the second set of witnesses came, we don't make her leave husband number 2. So Kika Amarav, Nami Bisman Shabo Eidim Va'achar Kach Nises. I will say, when does Rav say his position? Right, that she doesn't have to leave husband number 2. That's ultimately, again, when witnesses came. And then she remarried. La'afuke Midrai Menachem Bar Yossi. Ultimately, again, to exclude the position of Rabbi Menachem Bar Yossi. Good. V'ikadan, I will say, alternate version of this. Taima, the reason of Rav that he allows her to remain married to second husband is Denises va'achar kach bo edim, is because ultimately again she married and then the witnesses showed up. Aval bo edim va'achar kach nises teitze. But Allah l'maisa, if the witnesses came and then she remarried, ultimately again she would have to leave second husband. Kiman Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi. Fine, we'll say just an alternate version of Rav. So massive Rava. So we'll say let's analyze this because Rav's ruling is quite fascinating. That he allows her to remain with husband number 2. So let's analyze massive Rava. Minayin sheim lo ratza depano. So we'll say new case. Here we go. Kohen. We'll see you have a Kohen who ultimately again loves hanging out in cemeteries. Or this Kohen has a thing for gerushas, for divorcees. So I will say, and he refuses to separate himself from these things that he's not allowed to engage in. How do we know? Dipanu. I will say, panu means we beat him up. Right? We coerce him. In other words, that we could even use physical coercion to cause him to stop from engaging in this negative behavior. Talmud Lomar, v'kidashto. I will say, what does it say about the Kohen? This is great. What does it say about the Kohen? You could sanctify him. I will say, what does that mean? You can sanctify him, bal karcho. I will say, which is such an incredible yisod. Sometimes you have to sanctify people against their will. Right? Because right deep down, everybody wants Kedusha. Some people know it, some people don't yet know it. And sometimes you have to employ coercion for the purpose of sanctification. Hechidami, what's the case? Ilema deloni says, so say if we're talking about a case, I will say so ultimately Garashi, Hechidami, the Havadai be'isr mafursam va'afilo be'isr safek lo itzdirkra the vadai kaifinale. So I will say ultimately again, what's the case? Now I will say what we're doing over here, I will say is creating a paradigm. And what's the paradigm? That halacha l'maisa Then halacha l'maisa, there are situations where if somebody's unwilling to be kadosh, we're going to employ coercion in order to go and find the Kiddush. Well, we'll have to stop over here for today. So I will say, Emir Tashem, we'll pick up over here tomorrow. It's a shorter daf tomorrow, Emir Tashem. Not really, but we'll say it's a shorter daf for tomorrow. We'll pick up here tomorrow. So again, we'll discuss how we could employ forced coercion, ultimately in cases of Kiddusha. Shkach, I will say. Shorter daf based on one witness, yeah. It gets shorter over time. Emir Tashem. Shabbos.